begins tape 5 in the deposition of Dr. Peter F. Infante on the record at 11:44:44.
Dr. Infante, I just want to kind of clear up some last-minute housekeeping details. In going back and getting out the records, I find this report from Dr. Madsen in August 2002. Is that the report that you were referring to as his August report?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. Would you take just a minute and look through that report and also look through these documents that were provided along with his report, which are the backup documents that I understand, and tell me what of this you have received and what you have not received, if you can.
I'll do my best. Okay. Okay, I've received that report.
Okay, so you received this August 1, 2002 expert report by Dr. Madsen, which, if you'd help me look at this just so we can keep the record clear, it looks like it's now this looks like that attached to it is the original report. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's an earlier report.
Earlier report that we've already looked at. So we had his report and his CV and his earlier report, and you've seen all those things.
Yes.
Excuse me. Let's take it. We can break here a second if you need it. Let's go off the record.
Off the record at 11:46:50. On the record at 11:49:57.
Okay, doctor, so you have received the report that was done by Dr. Madsen in August of '99, and you received his CV, and you received this report that was done by him in August of 2002. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
All right, now, we received from Dr. Madsen these documents as supporting documents to his report, and they have started with Bates labels that begin with the number 402, and go on to 730. And I know this is a tough question, but best as you can recall, did you receive any of those? And if you did you receive the first 401 pages?
Well, these pages here look familiar.
And you're looking at the first 4 or 5 pages beginning with
Right.
402?
Yes. And these others, I can't remember if I received those or not.
Okay, and as you glance on down through that stack, I mean, they go all the way down here to, like I said, I think the last number is 730. Did you receive? Can you tell if you received all this information or not?
This document beginning 0433, I don't remember. So I look at it, I can't remember if that was in the stack of materials that I received or not.
Yes, sir. How about the next document down? And I believe your testimony is with respect to this document that started with 402, some of the pages look familiar, but some you couldn't tell.
Right.
All right.
This document beginning number 0497, I don't remember.
Okay.
In this next document, looks like I received some pages. It looked like they had this format, but I don't necessarily remember these pages.
And you're looking at a document that begins 0501,
Yes.
and so
I
your
could have,
testimony
I
is,
just don't remember.
okay.
In the rest of these documents, I might have received a couple of them, but I didn't receive all of them.
Okay, and you're looking at the documents beginning 0516 to the last document, which was 730, I believe?
Right.
Okay. Can you tell me if you recall receiving any documents that were labeled JM 0 through 401?
Where are those?
See, we started, your examination started here on, you've gotten these out of order, excuse me just a second. Your examination of documents as we were sitting here began with 402, and I'm asking you, do you recall seeing any documents that were labeled JM between the numbers JM 0 and JM 0401?
Yeah, that's not those then, right? Because this starts 402.
Correct. I haven't shown them to you because I don't have them. I'm asking you, did you receive them?
I can't remember, numbers on documents. I don't.
Do
No,
you
I'll
re-
tell you what I did. He asked me to provide my file to him because he said he was going to copy it and send it to the defendants, and that's what I did.
He
And
is
then when Mr. McLean.
Okay.
Then when I arrived here yesterday, it looked like all those documents that I gave to him that were in my file were in the stack that was here yesterday.
Okay.
So the extent to which any of these were in that stack, those are some that I looked at. And in addition to that, there was the Mattson August of 2002 report that I received subsequent to after having gotten these materials back from him, and whether there were a couple of these, there might have been a couple of these reports in them, I just can't remember.
Do you recall looking at anything related in this case that is not before you now? Either the stuff that you produced yesterday that we marked as Exhibit 3 or the stuff that you and I have just now been discussing that began with JM 402?
I mean, from what he sent to me.
Yes, sir. From the information that you have received through Mr. McLean. Well, my understanding is that you've not received any information from anyone other than Mr. McLean. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And my question to you is, do you recall receiving anything from Mr. McLean that was not part of what was either marked yesterday, Exhibit number 3, or part of what we have now looked at this morning, which are documents that begin with JM 402?
What's this? Was there a report by someone in Augustino or something like that? Is
Yes,
that
sir.
this
In
group?
Exhibit number 3, we have, if we look in Exhibit number 3, I think you'll find a report by Dr. Augustino. Is this the report you're talking about? It begins PI 76, was part of Exhibit 3 yesterday.
Yes, right, okay. As best I can recall, this seems like that what he sent me would be contained in this pile of documents.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Doctor. That's all the questions I have at this time.
Okay.
We'll take about a 10-minute break to get checked out of the hotel and so forth. We're going to try to get you over to lunch as soon as we can. Y'all mind working through lunch? Give you plenty of time.
Off the record at 11:58, 13:56.
Doctor, I just have a few other questions to ask you. When you're talking about the risk of leukemia, you mentioned yesterday as being 8 per 100,000 approximately. You're talking about out of 100,000 deaths, 8 of them in the background population or in the population at large are going to be from leukemia, right?
Yeah, I wasn't talking risk, I was talking about rate per
Right.
100,000.
Okay, so
Yeah. And I want to clarify one point from
Go.
earlier, when we were going through these documents and what I had been sent. These were documents that were related to exposure and various soil and water analyses that had also been sent a copy of, I think I mentioned yesterday, Dr. Wong's report, and then attachment. Then I received also copies of all the articles that he cited in his report. So I just want to get that straight. So I was only thinking the exposure stuff when we were going through these. Okay, I'm sorry.
okay, that's fine. But when we're talking about rates, we're talking about rates of death from leukemia in that context, correct?
Right, that's the average annual age-adjusted rate, essentially.
And so across the U.S. population, if you take the entire population and you break it down, you're going to have about 8 of 100,000 deaths across the country are going to be from leukemia. True?
Yes, that's right.
But if
All
you take,
ages combined.
but if you take a community of, say, 50,000, it's not necessarily so, is it, that you're going to get exactly 4 deaths in that community from leukemia, true?
Objection.
Of how many thousand?
If you have a community, a town of 50,000 people, it would be surprising to you as a statistician if you came out exactly as predicted, that is 4 deaths from leukemia.
Well, you would have to, in that particular situation, if you wanted to look at the community and say, okay, how many deaths would we expect? You would have to do some, age adjustment.
No, I'm talking about if you were looking at actual death certificates for 100,000 individuals who had lived in a community, you would be surprised if it came out exactly right for one particular town located, say, someplace in Ohio.
That if you looked at 50,000, would you expect 4? And you're asking me, would you be surprised if it came out to be 4?
Exactly.
No, I mean, that would be like, that would be the minimal, that'd be the minimal estimate. I mean, I'm not saying you would get 4. If you looked at it, I'm just saying that's right at the average. So I guess you could say, assuming that the age structure was similar to the U.S. population in that community, you essentially would expect 4.
All right. And by the same token, it would not be terribly surprising if you got no leukemias or if you got 10 leukemias in the population. True?
Well, I don't know whether it would be surprising or not. I mean, that could represent a significant increase. You'd have to do the statistics.
Have you ever heard of the term Texas sharpshooter?
I'm sorry, I'd like to hear about it.
Okay. Well, if you haven't heard it, you haven't heard it. In the context of epidemiology, have you ever heard of the term Texas sharpshooter?
No. The only time I heard of the concept of sharpshooter, other than shooting things, was when I worked on the railroad.
With respect to your testimony about chromosomal damage, in all cases where there is a chromosomal break, you do not necessarily have the development of cancer, do you?
I would think not, but the individuals that have like occupationally induced chromosomal breakage, they've followed some of these populations and they have an elevated risk of cancer.
All right, let me go to a different topic. Would you agree with me, sir, that statistics can be sometimes misleading?
Objection.
Statistics can be abused, can they not, sir?
Yeah, they can be, yes.
All right. Do you agree with the Hill criteria in the context of epidemiology as appropriate for measuring the efficacy of statistical results that you get?
Well, I think it's a bit strong to call them criteria. I mean, there are factors to consider when you're evaluating studies.
Well, as you have rephrased my question then, considering them factors, do you think that they are important factors to consider in evaluating data?
Yes, but I mean, there are also like limitations to some of them, as pointed out, I think, by Dr. Rothman in his statistics book. I think he goes through all of Bradford Hill paper and mentions the limitations of most of them, the different aspects of limitations.
Are the Hill criteria or factors, if you describe them, widely accepted in the field of epidemiology as being factors or criteria that should be considered in evaluating statistical results?
Well, there's some of the factors to consider, yes.
You have reviewed Dr. Wong's report that he prepared in relation to this case?
Yes.
And what criticisms do you have of Dr. Wong's report?
I think that he overplays the significance of some of the analyses that he's done.
Are you talking about overplaying his own papers that he himself has been responsible for preparing?
That he's published.
All right. Does he overplay anyone else's published literature?
Well, let me be more specific, first of all.
I was going to add, that was my next question.
By overplay, I think he overinterprets the results of some of his analyses and some of his papers. I also think that he was overly critical and didn't understand the exposure assessment and the National Cancer Institute study. And so I think his criticisms of the NCI study are not justified.
All right. Let's talk about specifics with respect to overinterpretation of his own results.
Okay.
In what way has he overinterpreted the results of his own work?
Well, for example, when he does his analysis of the cases of acute myelogenous leukemia in the Ply-film cohort, he doesn't identify a dose response in that analysis, so he concludes, or rather he uses, I think based on 6 deaths from AML, he looks at cumulative dose by response, and in the lower dose groups, for example, of that Ply-film study, there's hardly any individuals in those categories, so you really don't have enough statistical power to be able to evaluate the risk at those low levels. But as a result of his analysis, he concludes that that's a threshold for benzene and AML. And I mean, I think that's unjustified. No one's ever been able to identify a threshold for any human carcinogen.
All right. In what other way has he overinterpreted the results?
I think in some of his some of his studies that he's done, he's had very poor data on exposure, and I think that's probably responsible for his not being able to find a dose response because he really doesn't have data on dose.
All right.
And any bias that you get in exposure. I mean, most exposure misclassification is going to result in a bias toward the null hypothesis of no association.
All right. Any other criticisms that you have with respect to his overinterpretation of data?
Yeah, it looks, well, yes, in fact, in his gasoline distribution worker studies, when you look at the overall results, you see that his standardized mortality ratio for all causes, I think for the land-based, is only about 50% of what you would expect. And when you have such a significant deficit in mortality, that suggests that there may be selection bias in that study. And I think this was raised by Dr. Enterline when he initially reviewed the study at the request of the American Petroleum Institute at the benzene meeting that was held down in Miami, Florida. He thought that Dr. Wong, that may be indicative of selection bias.
And what was the selection bias specifically? Was it the healthy worker effect?
Well, it's hard to know what the selection bias is, but when you're doing a study and you're comparing it to the standard population, what you're trying to do is to have your study group very similar to your comparison group, with the only difference being the exposure. So you can determine what the effects are from exposure. Well, that population is clearly of his population that he studied of the gasoline distribution workers is very dissimilar to the comparison population, because the SMR for all causes of mortality is very low. It's only like about 50. So it's like you only get 50% of the mortality that you would expect. So that's an indication of some type of selection bias in who he chose to study. Either the plants that he chose to study or the people that he chose to study in those plants.
All right. So what you're saying is that there must have been a bias because only half the number of cases that you would have anticipated looking at national statistics occurred in that particular population?
Only half the number of deaths that you would expect. Yes.
You're talking about total deaths or leukemia deaths?
Total deaths.
Do you have any other criticisms of Dr. Wong's report?
Well, I think I had mentioned selection bias, misclassification, his mischaracterizing how the National Cancer Institute did their exposure estimation. He also misrepresents the pathological review from the lymphohematopoietic cancers and the leukemias in the NCI study. And he commented that whatever the percent was that was thrown out yesterday that he has in his report, that they only verified pathology for 60-some% of the AMLs, which I found I found that kind of ironic, because in all the studies that he's done, he hasn't verified the pathology in a single one, to my knowledge.
All right. Can you think of any other criticisms off the top of your head as you sit here today?
I think essentially misclassification, selection bias, and him not understanding NCI. Those are the study exposure assessment or their pathology review. I think those are the major. I'm sure if I looked over the whole report again and thought about it, I'd probably come up with some others.
And of course, the conclusion that he draws, that there is a threshold below which people are not at an increased risk of the various leukemias and lymphomas that you've associated with benzene. You disagree with his opinion that there is a threshold below which there is no increase in that risk?
I don't believe there's a threshold, and I certainly don't think his analysis has identified any threshold.
All right. With respect to his qualifications, do you have any criticism of his qualifications as they appear on his resume? Putting aside the fact that you are two professionals who obviously disagree with each other about the conclusions and how to interpret the data that's available.
No, I don't have any problem with his qualifications.
All right.
I mean, I might have other criticisms of some of his analyses, but those are just the ones that come to mind right now as we're sitting here.
In your statistical evaluation of the pliofilm workers, never mind, I'm going to save that one. I'm going to pass the witness. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, I got like 5 questions. Can I just ask them for here? Dr. Infante, I got just a couple of things which I think are just like purely housekeeping. I noticed in your report, or attached to your report, I think beginning on page 11 to the end is a list of references. Do you consider those to be authoritative in the field of epidemiology?
Well, yes. I mean, they're not the only authoritative reports, but they're the ones that I reference to support my statements.
When you started answering questions again for Mr. Warner, you were kind enough to clarify a previous answer that you had given. As you sit here right now, is there anything else that you can think of that you've said either this morning or yesterday that you need to clarify or correct?
Let me think about that for a minute. Sure. Not that I can recall at the moment.
Okay. What was your PhD thesis in?
My PhD thesis had to do with relationship between various parameters of child growth and development.
And have you ever taken any PhD level classes or courses in toxicology?
Well, I've taken courses in toxicology, yes, that PhD toxicologists also attended.
Objection, not responsive.
Have you, what course are you referring to?
Well, I've attended, a number of courses in toxicology that have been put on by various universities.
Okay, I guess you got your PhD at the University of Michigan, is my memory right on that?
Yeah, Doctor of Public Health.
Okay, and when you were taking the classes for that degree, did you take any courses in toxicology?
Oh, there might have been some. I can't recall.
You ever do any animal research in toxicology?
Not in the laboratory, but I've been involved in study design for animal studies.
So in the laboratory, you have not done any animal research in toxicology, is that correct?
I have not physically been in, well, actually, I have been in the laboratory for some courses that I took in toxicology. But as far as me conducting a study with hands-on in animals in a laboratory, I've only contributed to the study design, not to the actual sacrificing of the animals and looking at the pathology. No, I haven't done that.
Have you ever published any peer review articles on toxicology?
Yes.
And are those in your list? In your resume?
Yeah, they'll be in my CV.
Could you real quickly point those out for me?
Do you have a copy? Could I have a copy?
Sure.
It's here.
Is it?
Part of it's there.
No. Okay. Well, the utility of the animal cancer test for identifying carcinogens, that was published in The Lancet. That's the one I can think of.
And that was a peer-reviewed article?
Absolutely. And a number of these articles included toxicology as part of the contents of the paper, like the one in mutation research, for example, 1976, Infante et al. Carcinogenic, mutagenic, and teratogenic risks associated with vinyl chloride. That included both human and epidemiological data. The next one, evidence for the carcinogenicity of beryllium, International Conference on Heavy Metals in the Environment. That was mostly experimental animal data. The Infante and Wagner effect of lead on reproduction. A large part of that was experimental data, a paper. Well, Wagner, Infante, vinyl chloride, a case for the use of laboratory bioassay and the regulatory control procedure. So most of that was related to laboratory bioassay, which is experimental studies. Infante, carcinogenic and mutagenic risks associated with halogenated olefins. A large part of that was experimental data. Infante, epidemiologic approaches for surveillance of genetic hazards with particular reference to anesthetic gases. That was, a large part of that was experimental data. The next one, Ballman, Alexander, Infante, Wagner, and Lane, and Bingham. Vinyl halides, carcinogenicity. Vinyl bromide, vinyl chloride, and vanillidine chloride. Of those compounds, the only one where there was any evidence in humans was vinyl chloride. So the vanillidine chloride, the vinyl bromide, and any other vinyl halides mentioned that was based on experimental data. Infante, chloroprene, adverse effects on reproduction. Would probably be mostly experimental data. Infante and Marlowe. Evidence for the carcinogenicity of selected halogenated hydrocarbons, including ethylene dichloride. It's mostly experimental data. The next one, Infante, and well, that was a whole book we published, so. It was mostly ethylene dichloride. Actually, that was the whole Banbury report, so. Blackwell, Kahn, Thomas, Infante, formaldehyde, evidence of carcinogenicity. And most of that would be experimental data. The next one, Infante and Songus, mutagenic and oncogenic effects of chloromethanes, chloroethanes, and halogenated analogs of vinyl chloride, mostly experimental data. Should I keep going?
Is there anything else in particular that really stands out to you as a publication you did that concentrated on toxicology?
Yes. You want me to keep going?
If you just want to hit the highlights for me, that's fine.
Okay. This commentary, influence of genetic toxicology data on OSHA regulations. It would be all genetic toxicology data. It's almost all experimental data. Here's the one, Infante viewpoint, prevention versus chemophobia, a defense of rodent carcinogenicity tests. Infante and book, chemicals and human cancer. Infante, use of rodent carcinogenicity test for determining potential cancer risks to humans.
And those would all be peer-reviewed articles on, or publications on toxicology, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. I think that's probably sufficient. The last thing I want to ask you about is you indicate on your resume that your current position, that you are consulting in occupational environmental health. I assume part of that is related to litigation matters?
Right, and I'm also, it's not on there, I'm now adjunct professor at George Washington University in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences.
Okay, and are you currently teaching?
Yes.
And what class are you currently teaching?
Well, it's not my own class, it's other individuals. They're asking me to give lectures in their series of what's in their program that they've developed.
Okay, so you don't have classes yourself, but you lecture in other people's classes, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. As far as your consulting work, what percentage of your time do you spend on litigation-related matters as compared to other consulting work?
No, probably 80%.
Okay, and would that be fair as to your income also, fair approximation that about 80% of your consulting income comes from litigation-related matters as compared to other consulting work?
No, most of my income comes from consulting and litigation matters.
That's all I have. Thank you. Thanks,
You're
Larkin.
Anybody else have any? Anderson.
Dr. Infante, let me ask you a few questions. You talked about the metabolism of intermittent exposure to benzene. You called that line of questioning with Mr. Dyer this morning.
Yes.
And as I understood your answer, that is based upon animal studies. Is that correct?
Yes.
There have been no studies on humans of an epidemiological nature that show chromosomal damage based on intermittent exposure and increased metabolism of the benzene. Is that correct?
Well, Oh, wait a minute, the increased metabolism is a different.
Yes, let me re-ask the question.
Okay.
There have been no studies on human beings that have reproduced or replicated the results that were obtained in those animal studies concerning intermittent exposure to benzene, correct?
Humans, let me think about that for a minute. So see if I want to rephrase your question to make sure I'm answering the question that you're asking me. Are there studies in humans that would indicate that intermittent exposure to benzene would have more of an effect in causing chromosomal damage than continuous exposure?
You can answer that one, but that's not exactly my question. But what's the answer to that as you've raised it?
I haven't, and from a human population, I think it'd be difficult to determine that. But I haven't seen a study that addresses that.
Now, Dr. Infante, do you have formal training in cytogenetics?
No.
And you don't practice as a toxicologist, do you?
No.
Have you ever done any animal studies, for instance, descriptive animal studies?
I've been involved in the design of animal studies. I haven't done them in the laboratory myself, no.
Have you ever done any toxicological testing of human bone marrow, blood, body fluids of any kind?
No.
That's something that a hematologist would do, correct?
Or their laboratory person would do.
And I think you may have stated this yesterday, but you're not a medical doctor of any kind, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you talked a little bit yesterday about some of the chromosomal breakage studies that had been conducted, such as the Jacobson and Swartz studies. Do you recall that?
The Schwartz study, the Jacobson study wasn't a chromosomal study.
Okay, what about the Swartz study?
Well, that wasn't either. Those were those two studies were studies of gasoline service station attendants and mechanics.
Okay.
They weren't related to chromosomal breakage.
Okay, it did not relate to chromosomal breakage?
That's right.
Okay. Now, was the Swartz study a mortality study?
Yes.
Was it a proportionate mortality study?
Yes.
In terms of first-line evidence, would you rather use a cohort study before a proportionate mortality study?
If I had my choice in what study to use, I would prefer a cohort study. But those studies are useful also. It's just a matter of how you interpret them.
Is it your opinion that exposure to gasoline causes acute myelogenous leukemia?
Yes.
At what level of exposure to gasoline?
I think we already discussed earlier that your risk is related to your amount of exposure.
So the dose determines the poison?
No, it's a poison regardless of the dose. The amount of exposure is related to the risk.
Okay, so big exposure, big risk.
In general, yes, but there are also, with benzene and the benzene toxicological literature, a lot of reports related to, quote, hypersusceptibility, that people having similar exposures, one in a very short period of time develops blood diseases, working alongside of each other, and the others don't.
Okay. Now, I'm aware that you've expressed the opinion that a threshold has never been demonstrated for a carcinogen. You've said that here today, correct?
Yes.
On the question of threshold and whether or not there is a level below which exposure to benzene does not cause leukemia in humans, do you have an opinion that there is no such level, or is your opinion that we just don't know what that level is yet?
Well, I think that your chance of, your probability of developing leukemia is It's related to your exposure plus the individual susceptibility. So if you're exposed to very little, then your probability is very low.
So there may be a threshold, we just don't know what it is, correct?
Objection filed.
No, I'm not saying there's a threshold. I'm saying that you can have a probability of developing it, but it could be very low.
You talked about susceptibility. You're talking about that certain individuals would be more susceptible than others to develop leukemia?
Well, where hypersusceptibility has been related to benzene exposure in blood diseases, it's mostly been the various types of cytopenias that people have used.
Dr. Infante, are you aware of any cohort studies that have been done relating to childhood exposure to benzene? And I'm talking about direct exposure as opposed to exposure through a parent or a mother who's carrying the child.
Objection filed.
Well, I don't know where, specifically you would find a cohort of children exposed to benzene, but you did point out the one study that's been published. So you're aware of the literature on that.
Is there a standard measurement used for cumulative exposure to benzene?
Yeah, for cumulative exposure, it's usually expressed in parts per million years.
And it can be expressed in parts per million months sometimes?
Yeah, sure.
It's a matter of multiplying the time of exposure by the level of exposure for that time period to determine the cumulative dose, correct?
Yes.
And you have not made such a calculation of that in this lawsuit, correct?
That's correct.
And thus, since you haven't done a study, is it fair to say that you do not have an opinion as we sit here today as to the cumulative benzene exposure sustained by any plaintiff in this lawsuit?
That's correct.
And do you have an opinion as to any cumulative benzene exposure sustained by Mr. and Mrs. Ozuna's little girl who died in 1983?
You're giving me credit for more information than I have.
You haven't done any such study, have you?
I don't know who you're talking about.
Okay, fair comment. Have you been asked to attempt to do such a cumulative benzene exposure study on any person involved in this case as a plaintiff?
No.
I think I'm just about through, Dr. Infante. Yesterday, I asked you if you would take a look at the front page of the letter that we couldn't read, and also if you could locate your invoice in this case. Were you able to look at that original of that page and bring it with you?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Okay, let's take exhibit number, which one was that, 2 or?
Here it is.
There it is, the first page of exhibit 3. And if you would, Doctor, let's just match up this language that's directly under the internet address, www.rcmlaw.com. What does that say on the letter that you have there?
Well, the word that begins with R.
No, right under the internet address. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, it says, put in baggie and then sample air.
Do you know what does that refer to, if you recall?
For the taking soil samples.
And is there parentheses under that?
Yes.
And what does that say?
This says dirt in bag.
Okay. And then under that, there is another phrase that seems separate and apart. What does that say?
This says, are the readings for volatile organics should be in air from sample. And it says, are those on north side, question mark? And the answer is yes.
Okay. And was that a question that you had based upon what you'd received?
Yes.
Okay. And then finally, the notation that you've made at the bottom of the page, off to the left under the, to the left of Mrs. Baca's signature, what does that say?
It says all, it's like measurements by defs must be defendants.
Okay. And we still have Mr. McLean's cell phone number on there in case we need to
Put
reach him.
lemon on that and hold it up to a flame and get my new cell phone.
No magic decoder ring or anything like that required. That's good. That's good. And did you also take a look at the number of hours that you charged Mr. McLean for your services prior to your deposition yesterday?
No, I haven't had a chance to do that. Well, I thought that yesterday.
You agreed to furnish
he
me
was
the
going to
invoice.
furnish
You,
it.
you did agree to furnish me the invoice. Finally, Doctor, we have an exhibit sticker over there. We lost them yesterday.
Okay.
Thank you. And is our next one 6, I believe? Exhibit 6. I think 5 was, this was the last one we marked was,
That's 4.
that's 4. 5 was the article that you published on the historical.
Okay.
So I believe our next would be 6. Let me hand you what's been identified as exhibit number 6. We've talked about the Australian study throughout this particular deposition, and I know that there's a health watch portion of it, but is exhibit 6 the study that you cite to in your report as Gray 2001?
So if it's 2001, then yes.
Okay. And then Gray is Dr. Chris Gray, correct?
Yeah, I was just looking for his name on here because there are 2 reports. There's the cohort study from 2000. I forget what that person's name is, so I was just looking to see if Gray was on here somewhere.
I think I could help you with that, I think.
Oh, here we go. Chris Gray, study director.
Yeah, okay. He's over here. So is this, when you cite to Gray 2001, this is the report you're citing to?
Yes, it is.
Okay. That's all I have, Dr. Infante. Thank you very much for your time.
Do you want a rubber band for that?
Does anybody have anything else? We're done. All reserved.
This concludes day 2 of the deposition of Dr. Peter F. Infante. It consists of 5 videotapes. Off the record is 12:57:59.
Nice.